The government published its white paper on devolution this week. We'll be reflecting on that, plus Labour's travails with the Doctors' Union and Unite. More bad news on the economy too, with growth shrinking for the second consecutive month. But on a more positive note, a successful state visit of President Macron. Can the new deal with France help stop the boats? And 40 years on, yes, can you believe it? 40 years on, we'll be reminiscing about the greatest gig ever held, Live Aid. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den, everybody, and joined as ever by Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock, and lots of things to get through. So with no further ado, James, you and I very exercised, of course, with that issue of devolution. It's something that we've been following and promoting for, well, 3 decades in my case, 6 in yours. And at the end of the day, we see a white paper finally published this week from the government, which is offering mayors more powers, combined authorities greater say over things like planning, and also, I think importantly, giving a big indication that people like Andy Burnham, Tracy Brabin, Steve Rotherham, Richard Parker are going to be given an opportunity of having more cash to spend on their priorities. So a move, we would say, in the right direction. And the other big change that was made in terms of that white paper was a switch back in terms of the election systems for the polls when mayors are elected. So we're going to go from first past the post voting system to a proportional system, which is single transferable vote. What that does, I would suggest, is make it less likely for reform candidates to win mayoralties. But of course, we wait and see how that pans out. But Jim, overall, I think for devolutionists like you and I, a big step in the right direction.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we aren't going to rehearse my preferred model that was in place and being developed under Tony Blair and was destroyed by Eric Pickles, which was a regional government which could take really broad strategical issues in the Northern Way for the whole of the North. And so on. We've now moved on to a more city-orientated model, although not exclusively, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But yeah, you've put your finger on it. I mean, most people aren't interested in structural alterations. What they are interested in is, are these people going to be given money which they can spend? Because the whole raison d'etre of this is that we know what needs to be done in the north of England far better than Whitehall. And the only way of expressing that, getting Whitehall to recognise that, getting the Treasury to recognise that, is actually to give big pots of money to the mayors to spend as they wish. And that does seem to be one of the themes of this. Of course, the model of mayors is well developed with Tracy Brabin and Andy Burnham. Obviously, this is a much more comprehensive proposal because the government wants the whole country basically to be run on the basis of sort of combined authorities with mayors, and we have 2 big holes in that proposal in the northwest, one Lancashire and the other in Cheshire. Now in Lancashire it's got a bit complicated because there was a lot of infighting between East Lancashire and Blackburn and Blackpool and all this sort of thing, and an interim arrangement's been made which only came into force a few months ago. And the question is whether that's going to be changed again for a mayoral model. And finally, Cheshire and Warrington, who had their differences, have finally come together, and we'll see whether an elected mayor works there. The last thing is, of course, the defection of Jake Berry, the former Rossendale MP, to Reform UK. I was in Westminster on Thursday, and there was widespread speculation that he will seek to stand for the mayoralty of Lancashire on the basis that Reform did quite well there. but there are other candidates. And over the weekend, you made an interesting point to me about this change in the voting system, the single transferable vote, where you have to get 50%. So if you don't on the first, the transfers are made, and that will prevail against reform. But no, these are important changes. I mean, a lot of people will say, with the economic situation, do we want to be distracted by this? I mean, there's always an argument against doing these things because there's bigger priorities, the health service and welfare and all that sort of stuff. But the government do seem to be taking the view that they've got 5 years in power and they want to get on with this.
Well, Downtown held a Northern Power Towns conference on Friday in Warrington, where we had a lot of the business and civic leaders from Cheshire and Lancashire in the room. And there was a couple of things that people seem to be fairly consensual around. One was that they are fairly sure now that the election for mayors in both counties will be pushed back to 2027 to give time for those restructures and transitions to take place. Interesting what you're saying about Lancashire, James. Just to be clear, Blackburn, Blackpool and the previous county council were all on the same page in terms of wanting a combined authority and wanting an elected mayor. The challenge they have in Lancashire is with the districts. All the districts fight like rats in a sack because none of them want to lose their badge as councillors, despite the fact that a devolved model would provide much more power, resource and importantly cash into the county. But who should care about the people of Lancashire and the economic development of the county when you can keep your badge as a councillor, hey? Of course, that's changed because the county council in May went reform. And Reform are saying that before any changes made to local government arrangements in Lancashire, they would like to see a referendum. They love the referendums to the Reform gang, don't they? That would cost £2 million. Jim McMahon, Angela Rayner, who are, of course, in charge of the Department for Local Government and therefore will make the decisions on these matters, have ruled that out. So I suggest that the mayoral model will certainly be in place by Cheshire, by 2027, possibly in Lancashire too. Much in terms of Jake Berry's future will depend on his consistency, because he's been a little bit all over the place over the past 4 or 5 years as Jake Berry. The last time I had a conversation about him with somebody who knew him fairly well, I was told that his wife didn't particularly like Lancashire and he was considering going for the Cheshire mayoralty. So we'll see whether he's been able to sort his differences out with Mrs. Berry. And I think the other point I'd make is that in all of these things, it's a shame, isn't it, that we would all accept, I'm going to come to you on this point, Joe, that those mayoralities will be won on the basis of which political party is performing best at national level. And actually, if these things are to mean anything moving forward, it should be about the people who are running for those posts. And brings me back to, Jake Berry decided, oh, well, I've got a bit of a profile there, don't really bother with the place anymore. But hey, if Reform are doing well nationally in the polls, I've got a chance of winning that mayor's job.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, nowhere is that more evident than Andy Street losing his mayoralty to be replaced by Labour, which may or may not turn out to be a good thing. But I think the general consensus was that Andy was doing a really good job and he caught the cold as everybody sneezed against the Conservatives. So I think, there is that problem. But I think there are politicians, and certainly the mayoralty gives them that platform, if you like. I mean, Ken Livingstone to a large extent in London was that, Boris Johnson to a certain extent in London first time round. Definitely Andy Burnham and Tracy as well. These are people who actually are above and beyond politics and people can relate to, because they can actually see and feel the impact, whether it's about buses or jobs or education or roads. So I think it's really successful. I think what is interesting is that there are parts of the country, like here where I am in Kent, and also Norfolk and Suffolk, which will have one mayoralty, where there haven't been mayors. So they're a bit sort of, oh, well, we don't know quite what we're going to get here. And as you rightly say, Frank, there are people at various duplicated council levels go, oh, no, we can't possibly do that. Well, we've been campaigning for a town council here because the district council is useless. And then we've got another layer of county council, all replicating and overlapping and all costing us an enormous amount of money. I think one of the interesting places, though, is Bristol, where they voted to no longer have a mayor, even though they had the very, very excellent Marlin Rees, who was really, really good. And they did lots of stuff on housing and on regen, and they got funding. And I just sort of think, so actually they got rid of the idea of having a mayor when everybody else seems to be going for it. And it would be quite useful, I think, to get people like Andy Burnham and Tracy and Richard and Steve Rotherham and all of those people almost on a sort of a roadshow to say to people, this is what we've done. It's not about politics. It's about where you live, to encourage people who haven't got mayors to get involved and take part. And just a final point on the reform thing. Well, 2 points, really. One is reform needs to watch out they don't just become a receptacle for former Tories, because if those Tories didn't win at the election, well, why are they going to win next time with a different badge and a turquoise shirt on? So I think Nigel Farage needs to be mindful of that. And certainly in the conversations I've had with him, he is very keen on PR. And, you can see why. And they got 4 million votes last year in the general election. They got 5 MPs. Now they're down to 4. Could be 5 again by the end of the week. Could be 4. Who knows? Could be 3. But I think, the PR argument was spectacularly lost when Nick Clegg forced a referendum as a result of, as a condition of doing a coalition deal with David Cameron. Nobody gave a monkeys about it then. And then you get the nerdy people going, oh, we don't want single transferable vote. You've got to do this, that, and the other. And you just go, actually, I want my vote to count. And if you have it and you bring it back for the mayoral elections, as we used to have for the European elections, and they do in Scotland, well, then people just do it. They understand it.
Yeah, so I think the point you make about different localities and residents deciding, well, we want this model and we want that model, is one of the things that Labour is determined to tackle. This patchwork quilt approach that we have to local government isn't helpful. Certainly, I think what people have found in those areas that do have a mayor is, whatever else you say about those people, is they act as a champion, a lightning rod for issues, for funding, for the sort of priorities that local people are looking for. And Andy Burnham is probably the best example of this, but he's not the only one. Steve Rotherham, Kim McGuinness in the North East, there's people now, Claire Ward, I think, in the East Midlands as well, who really are making a name for themselves in Whitehall because they have that direct access to government and they're able to make the case for those additional funds, or not necessarily for additional funds, but for the funds that are coming into their city regions to be spent in different ways. And I think that's the important change that we're beginning to see. But as I say, it's a shame, I think, that people still cast their vote at those local and regional elections on the basis of what the national political parties are coming to. I'm conscious that we've got an awful lot to get through today, so I want to move on, if I may, to Labour's travails with the trade unions. And of course, we've had Angela Rayner being suspended from Unite, although the Deputy Prime Minister claims that she's not been a member of Unite for a while anyway, so the suspension somewhat surprised her. This all comes around the controversy in Birmingham and the City Council's dispute with the bin men and women, which I have to say, we've been in Birmingham for 10 years. I can't remember a time when they weren't in dispute with the refuse workers, to be honest. And then the other thing that has grabbed the national headlines more and would, of course, have a bigger impact on the UK is this threat of the doctors to strike again, despite the fact that they got a whopping pay increase only a year ago. They're now back for more. And this perhaps is a salutary lesson to Labour ministers that giving these pay increases out willy-nilly without some conditions and some firm conditions, it's not necessarily a great idea. The unions, particularly those not affiliated with the party, are not necessarily your friends. And so they find themselves in the position where they've managed to upset the trade unions now as well as everybody else. So, Jim, what's your take on, first of all, this spat between Unite and Labour, which could be serious because, of course, Unite are a big donor to the Labour Party. And then let me have your thoughts on the doctors' dispute as well.
Right. Firstly, on the question of Birmingham, it's been badly reported actually, but I know some people involved on the inside of this, and of course we have two senior officers, Joanne Roney as the chief executive and Claire Cully, who's the chief finance officer, both gone from Manchester to Birmingham. So they've walked into this cauldron, but I think they're taking quite a tough line on it, and obviously they've got commissioners in there as well. The basic thing is that for a long time there's been an insidious deal between Unite and the GMB union and others. The men get a pay increase, and then everyone else puts in another pay claim to get equal pay. And it's interesting that Angela Rayner is now making this an issue. Sharon Graham herself is not particularly interested in the Labour Party. I mean, Len McCluskey was deeply involved in the politics of the Labour Party. She apparently isn't. She just sees herself fighting for her own members. And therefore, she, but we have had these threats before, even from Len McCluskey, and they, on balance, decide not to do it. Also, Labour's in a very difficult position. You can see why Angela Rayner probably should a long time ago, especially if she was going to intervene in the dispute, couldn't be a Unite member. But Unite are very powerful in the Labour Party, both in the councillors in Birmingham, who over years have failed to grasp and deal with multiple problems they've had, dealing with equal pay and things like that. And also, of course, the number of MPs in the country have stayed strangely silent about this, apart from Angela Rayner. So it is a question of the overweening power of Unite, who seem to have no consideration for the people of Birmingham. I mean, I was in Birmingham for a conference about 2 weeks ago, and I must say the city centre is absolutely pristine, but it's in the outer suburbs that the poor people are suffering from rats and things like that. Times have changed on the bins. As I understand it, the last person on the back of the lorry isn't needed anymore. The council tried to give them non-job sort of consulting with people about litter, but they're bankrupt. And Unite just have no sense of having to make an accommodation, which brings me neatly to the other subject you raise. The National Health Service is in great difficulty. The doctors have already had 28% unconditional, which I think was possibly a mistake. And it's very interesting. I was in the Commons gallery, the press gallery, when Wes Streeting was making his statement. And I must say, it was a formidable exercise. I mean, the Conservative opposition spokesman had to go through the motions of trying to critique it. But frankly, Wes Streeting said everything that the Tories and any other party wanted to do. And there was unanimity, the Liberal Democrats as well, I think, in saying that they can't have this money. And it's going to be very interesting. I wonder whether, I don't know what you guys think, whether an off-ramp is being created by today's talks on conditions for doctors, because there are issues around when they're rotated and the sort of rooms they have to rest in and holidays and things like that, which, we don't want doctors who are going to treat us to be in poor conditions. So there may be an off-ramp there. But if they go ahead with 5 days of strikes and people start to be told and the media starts to cover that Jim Hancock's, well, they probably won't have sympathy for me, but, Joe Phillips' appointment has been cancelled, and really worrying cases. The doctors are going to be in a very, very difficult position. But in both the cases of Unite and the doctors, I don't want to over-rehearse sort of Tory tropes on this, but the people that go to conferences and the people that pass these motions are not necessarily representative of their members. And the question is whether the moderate members of both the BMA and Unite wake up smell the coffee and participate in their union's activities?
Well, it's a great point you made there, Jim, because in terms of the doctors' strike ballot, there was a very, very low turnout. I think it may have been as low as 30%. It was as bad as a local election turnout. And they've ended up going on strike. And I think there is a case to be made for Angela Rayner to relook at her employment rights bill. And perhaps I may gently suggest to the Deputy Prime Minister that she looks at the voting mechanism for going on strike, because I think it may have been even a Margaret Thatcher policy to say that more than a certain number of people need to vote in those ballots if strike action is to take place. I think that is a fairly reasonable and sensible way to move forward. But the point about both, I think, the refuse workers in Birmingham and certainly the doctors, is the public sympathy is not with them, it's with the politicians, and that's an unusual place to be. So therefore, Joe, my advice to the BMA would be have another look at this industrial action, because the support you received last time around from the general public simply won't be there this time.
Absolutely, and nor will it be there from their colleagues in the health service, like the nurses and the paramedics, the radiographers, the physiotherapists, you know, the phlebotomists and all of those people who keep the health service going, who settled for the pay award that was recommended, you know, by the independent board, and they've accepted that. Well, it's, you know, it's single figures. And I think, you know, whilst people might say Wes Streeting was a fool to do a deal with them to end the strikes with no conditions, if now is his chance to go, okay, here are the conditions. First of all, we'll make medical school free, absolutely free. If you're doing a medical degree, no student loans, but you commit to work in this country for the NHS for at least 5 years, because it's utterly ridiculous. You know, they say, oh, we've got £90,000 in student debt. I'm going to Australia. Right, okay, well, thanks a lot. That's great. So you've trained here, you've paid for it, you know, well, that's fine. And you're going over there. So the benefit to us, the taxpayer, is absolutely FA. And I think there is absolutely no sympathy. And the way they are using the figures to argue, they're using RPI, a retail price index, which was abolished in 2013 as a measure of anything. Although, to be fair, the BMA woman this morning was saying, well, the government do use it for rail fares or something, you know, bizarrely. But, you know, it's the old thing about statistics, oranges and lemons and all of that sort of stuff. But this banging on about we want to be paid what we would have been paid in 2008. Well, I tell you what, I'd really like to be able to buy a house at 2008 prices. It's risible. There's no public sympathy for them. Nobody forces you to go and train to be a doctor. And I think, you know, they are all in a position when they are qualified, and yes, we need them, and yes, we support them, but yes, lay it down on the line, Wes. Tell them they can have extra rooms, they can have, you know, shorter shifts, they can do this, that, and the other, but you can't have it always, and it shouldn't be about money. And you can't reform the NHS. The doctors are a part of the NHS. They're not the main part, actually. And there are many ways that money could be spent on better things and better outcomes. And just briefly on Unite, they're not being very helpful. And, you know, one of the reasons Birmingham City Council is bust is because of the huge claim, the equal pay claim, for the women working for Birmingham City Council. And you do have to think, at what point did you think equal pay law didn't apply to you? At what point didn't somebody within that organisation say, hang on a minute, we're in danger of getting a claim here, or one trickling through that they could have settled and then changed things? So, you know, part of it is through their own making and their own sort of blinkeredness. But I don't think Unite are being particularly helpful. And you have to say, okay, they might not be perfect, but it's a bit like you wrote, you know, a couple of weeks ago, Frank, about the MPs rebelling against welfare reform. You don't want this. All right, well, we won't have this then. Okay, well, we won't do anything. We'll just plod along and muddle through and everything will be absolutely fine because you're not going to get impacted. Oh, guess what? and we'll vote the Tories or Reform in next time round, and they're not going to be sympathetic. So, you know, it seems to me it's a lose-lose, and the government needs to get tough.
Yeah, I mean, the equal pay situation is very, very complicated and complex, and it did creep up on Birmingham and other local authorities, to be fair to them. There is a case, and Jim will know far more about this than I, that they ought to have been more urgent in their response. You're absolutely right as far as that's concerned, Joe. But there's all-out elections in Birmingham next year, I think. And so there's a real chance for reform to take control there. And as you rightly say, the chances of them being sympathetic to anything Unite say, it is, well, for the birds, really. And I'd also point out that the offer that is being made is still relatively generous. Given where we are, there will be an awful lot of perhaps more austere local government leaders saying, sorry guys, we don't need 50% here, so here's your redundancy pack. As Jim has said, what they're doing is they're offering these people alternative non-jobs to an extent. So maybe they need to get a bit tougher and start making those redundancies and quick, but it needs to be brought to a close, because that dispute, as I say, for the last 10 years, there seems to be some sort of row happening between refuse workers and the city council. So they need to try and draw a line under it somehow. And in terms of the doctors, well, there are talks going to take place, I understand, this week between Wes Streeting and the union leaders, BMA leaders. Hopefully they will come to a positive conclusion. But I repeat, I don't think that there is going to be much of any sympathy for doctors if they strike again, having had that 28% pay increase less than 12 months ago. Okay, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll be looking at the economy, President Macron's visit, and reminiscing about Live Aid. Stay with us, we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, joined as always by Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. Before we get into our conversation for this part of the pod, let me just remind people that our annual Regeneration, Property and Infrastructure Conference will be taking place on Thursday, the 11th of September. That's going to happen at Hotel Voco in Manchester, and we've got a whole range of great speakers coming along from the world of local government. Leader of Liverpool City Council, Liam Robinson, James Lewis, Leeds leader, Pam Smith, Chief Executive of Newcastle, Joanne Roney, she may want to talk about the bins to us, Managing Director of Birmingham City Council, Julie Nugent, Coventry City Council, Stephen Young, who by that time will be Chief Executive of Salford City Council. They are among a whole array of senior decision makers, executives, political leaders, who will be joined by some of the leading private sector practitioners from the property industry. So please join us. That's Thursday, the 11th of September, Hotel Voco in Manchester. If you go to the show notes, Christopher, our producer, will put a link in and show you how you can register for tickets. Right, let's move on.
And I'll be there signing autographs as well.
Excellent. Jim and Joe can come and sign autographs. There you go. That's fabulous. I mean, it's an offer that you can't refuse. And in fact, Trevor Stephen is going to be there, ex-legend, of course, in terms of international football, and a great star of that brilliant Everton team of the mid-80s. And he'll be there signing James's head. So come along. Come along. and witness that fabulous occasion. Right, let's move on. And Rachel Reeves, well, it was tears before bedtime or tears before bad news. Prime Minister's questions fortnight ago was followed by some bad news in terms of another shrink in the economy, 0.3%, followed by last month's decline in economic growth as well. So this big idea that Labour have got, Joe, which is to grow the economy, not quite getting there. And you do look at what's happening in the world with Trump and his tariffs and the war in Ukraine carrying on, Netanyahu being an absolute tyrant in the Middle East. How are they going to be able to get themselves out of this melee? And if they can't, and it looks increasingly likely that they're going to find it very, very challenging to get onto that growth agenda anytime soon, at what point do they have to bite the bullet and say, we're going to have to increase some taxes, guys?
Well, quite soon. I think, certainly by the time we get to the autumn and the autumn statement, she's going to have to come up with something, because, these are tiny movements. They are flickers on a screen, but they are indicators nevertheless. There's a report out this morning saying that, she needs to be slightly more relaxed about the OBR and really look at the bigger picture. And I think, this is something we've talked about before, that she's not that she is a woman of the Treasury and to a certain extent imprisoned by her own making, but she hasn't perhaps got that sort of broader outlook. And that broader outlook is partly, as you say, Frank, external factors beyond our control. Now, it may be that the fine weather over the last few weeks will have bucked up retail. That might create a little bit of encouragement and optimism in hospitality, for instance. But you've still got problems. And, and the downside of that, of course, is that we've now got a hosepipe ban, and many farmers in the east of the country are not even being allowed to extract water. And so, you've got problems of the cost of vegetables, crops, meat, all of those things will have an impact on shopping baskets and the cost of living. So it is very difficult. I mean, they are in this, they're like people trying to sort of sort out a derelict house. And every time you think you've got a bin bag full of one lot of rubbish, a wall falls down and there's another lot. So, one can sympathise to a certain extent, but they've got to be really clear about where they want to do reform for reform's sake, as we discussed last week on welfare, and where they need to get money in. And there are growing calls within and without the Labour Party for some sort of wealth tax. Now, that might not be on individuals. It could be corporation tax. It could be, okay, stand up to Trump and make Amazon and the American tech companies pay their fair share, even though they, find ways around it. Do something more on second homes. There are ways of doing it, but I think, the terrible uncertainty with Trump and his tariffs that may or may not be 30% or maybe 50% or maybe nothing, or who knows, we haven't even talked about China. But, that is going to have a huge impact on potential investment, potential partnerships, the cost of doing business. And of course, the elephant in the room that they won't talk about, but they should, is because of bloody Brexit. Yeah. And until the government comes out and says, absolutely, the cost to us of doing business, never mind Ukraine, never mind COVID, part of this was Brexit. And had we not done Brexit, we would have been in a better place and stronger to deal with Ukraine and COVID, etc., etc. They need to change the conversation, and they need to go, so we need to make it easier to do business with Europe, etc., etc. Stand up to Trump where important, but it's very difficult to see how they can get out of it without tax, or at least freezing the thresholds, which means that more working people at the bottom end of the scale will be pulled into the tax paying net.
Well, she will absolutely freeze the threshold, the tax thresholds. She's in no way, shape or form able to move on that. I think the wealth tax is a bit of a red herring. It's been introduced in other countries. It's never worked. It doesn't raise the sort of cash that people think it will. I think the idea of looking at people's property assets is long overdue, but it's a hellishly complicated and complex matter. And I think what the government ought to have learned, if nothing else over the last 12 months, is that you can't rush into these big radical changes without laying the pitch without actually explaining to people what you're doing and why you're doing it. So none of those things in the short term are going to help her. And what was really evident from that OBR report, which basically said that the UK is going to hell in a handcart over the next decade unless something dramatically changes, is that sentence within the report that said the UK has not got the capacity to deal with fiscal shocks. And one of the reasons for that is why? Brexit, because we don't have that safety net of other partners who can help and assist and support at times of difficulty. And that decision, Joe, as you rightly say, is one that if Labour are not prepared to talk about it now, when are they going to be able to talk about it? And the more I look at the straitjacket that she finds herself in, and the more that you see these conversations week on week, talking and pestering cabinet ministers, inevitably so, where are you going to find the money, Minister? What are you going to do? Whose taxes are you going to increase? The more I think there's got to be almost a state of the nation speech from the Prime Minister or the Chancellor to say, when we took over, this was the position we were in. We've had Donald Trump. We've had a continuation and escalation, in a sense, of the war with Ukraine. We've got to find money for defence. I'm awfully sorry, but taxes are going to increase. And the simplest one, and the one that would raise you enough cash to put this to bed for a couple of years and give you the opportunity to start having conversations about how do you start to tax people who've got wealth in property, I think, and I never thought I'd say this, but I've been convinced, is an increase on VAT. I don't think she's going to go there. But Jim, we simply can't go through the next 4 years of every week talking about what's the budget next year going to look like.
Yes, well, you've both eloquently given the solution to this problem, and I would like to see that State of the Union speech to be a bold attempt to actually reverse the Brexit decision and begin down that path, because all other options to me seem extremely difficult, particularly in relation to growth. It's only through growth that we're going to get out of this. And you both have talked about tax increases, but that surely is going to make growth less likely. I mean, I'm struck by the number of employers who are complaining about the government's moves on things like the minimum wage and national insurance contributions for employers, what a dampening effect that's had on their decisions on employment and investment and things like that. So I can't for the life of me see that an announcement about putting VAT up, I know you make it with the best of intentions, I would have thought that would have another depressive effect on the country. I mean, I wrote a rather pessimistic blog last week for Downtown. I'm afraid I do not see any solution to this situation. I think the government is just going to bob along, trapped between Rachel's red lines and this unwillingness to grasp what I can see as the only solution to this, which is getting closer to our European neighbours and, as you say, having the heft of all being together. They're not going to do that because they think they're defying the people of this country, and it's going to take a very painful period of time before people realise that that is the only solution.
But
I mean,
nothing
there
will
was
improve, Jim.
No, I don't think anything will improve. I think it's going to be really, they probably will go for tax increases, which will further depress growth, and we are just going to bob along.
Well, I think
I'm deeply pessimistic.
Sorry, Jim. Sorry to cut across you there. I think if you increase VAT, which is often seen as a regressive tax, and I understand why, but of course, food and children's clothes are excluded from VAT. I think you could introduce some more exemptions to help businesses in particularly struggling industries. And I'm thinking, of course, mostly about the hospitality sector as far as that's concerned. But it does raise you a lot of cash, and it raises you a lot of cash quickly. And of course, it was a tax that both Margaret Thatcher and Judge Osborne introduced, and it didn't have a depressing effect on the economy because it's a tax that we all pay to an extent. And as businesses, of course, we claim it back. And so it's not as bad a tax for business as Joe's suggesting, for example, an increase in corporation tax, which I can tell you would have entrepreneurs running for the hills. So I think that in terms of the difficult choices that she's got to make, none of these things we're suggesting are going to be popular or are not going to be met with an absolute furore from the right-wing press. But she gets that anyway. Whatever she does now, she's going to get that stick. And what they need to do, in my view, is try somehow, some way to draw a line, to give themselves some headspace and some thinking space so that they can begin to map out a vision for a fairer tax system in the next parliament. But the way they're going on, as you rightly describe it, Jim, bobbing along from crises to crises. Joe's analogy was fabulous, you know, derelict house. Every time they sort one problem out, there's another one pops up over here. In order to be able to give themselves, as I say, some breathing space and a chance of winning that next election, then they're going to have to bite the bullet on something, Joe.
Yeah, and the other thing they could do, and I take your point about wealth tax and you know, VAT. Yes, I agree, Frank. It's something I would never have thought I would agree with, but because you can claim it back if you're a business, it's not so awful, and it does affect everybody, and you can make choices. The other thing, of course, which has been mooted for quite a while, is it is high tide. There was a revaluation of property bans for council tax, because you've got, you know, property of varying degrees around the country. Now, if you could be smart and clever, do a revaluation right across the country, but you also could hypothecate, Liberal Democrats love that word, a certain amount to go to local authorities. That would take the pressure off local authorities for a little bit. And it would also mean that you would change the property demographic, because you then might encourage, you know, people who are rattling around in houses on their own that they don't really, to sell up, free up those houses for family homes, which then means you don't need to keep building the same, taking more and more water, etc., etc. So, you know, property, and we know that housing is so intrinsically linked to welfare, health, educational opportunities and everything else. It does seem to me that you could tackle some of those things in a complicated but joined up way at the same time as you did an instant thing on VAT. And the other thing is, and I know there will be people listening who probably vehemently disagree with me, why did she not raise fuel duty? You know, huge lobbying from the motorists organisation. Well, I'm sorry, everything else has gone up, but why keep that there when that's another instant way and people can make choices? And okay, if you're going to put it onto the consumer because you're a delivery driver, well, that's okay. But, you know, if you're a private individual and you're just driving and you're not paying duty on filling up your walloping great car, well, that seems to be a bit bonkers.
Great point, particularly on somebody who drives an X5 Guzzler. I'm not so sure about the fuel use. No, you're absolutely right on that. And to be fair, though, I think this obsession we have with property prices and protecting our assets and our wealth and inheritance, and it's bloody bonkers, isn't it? I mean, I don't think anywhere else in Europe or even maybe the States have the same attitude towards property. It's nuts. I mean, my wife's obsessed with the value of our house. You know, I'm just happy to live in it. She's like looking every week on where it is on Zoopla and all this shite. We are a nation of obsessives when it comes to property prices. And don't tax us on our wealth.
No.
We've worked really hard. Well, half the time, no, you haven't. Your bloody mum and dad or your grandma or their great-grandma worked hard.
And meanwhile, the people who work
for you
are paying twice as much as they would on a mortgage on a rent because you've got a second property.
All property is theft. Property is theft.
I wouldn't go that far, James. You get into Jeremy Corbyn territory there. Let's move on, though, because we will be coming back, I'm sure, to the economic challenges that Rachel Reeves and the country finds itself. But, Jim, talk about Brexit, and President Macron was in town this week. State visit, of course, a very jolly occasion. It's a state dinner with King Charles. And it looks as though King Charles did a decent job on him, warming him up for Keir and the gang, and they've done some sort of deal on this one in, one out on immigration, which, it's strangely enough, the Tories have dismissed as not going anywhere far enough. But of course, is about 500% more people that would be returned from our shores than the Tories were suggesting when they were paying millions of pounds to Rwanda. Of course, nobody eventually got there, but at best, Rwanda would have taken 200 people a year. On a serious note, though, you wrote, I think very accurately, about the challenges, the worries, the concerns that people have about immigration, and the need for the government to get a grip. I just wonder, Jim, how you think that can happen now. Is it simply a case of, well, we'll abolish, or we'll withdraw, from ECHR? Should we be working with other countries who seem to be coming round to this view now that that is outdated and therefore needs to be rewritten and reviewed? Because when you look at what's happening across the pond and the way in which Trump is tackling this issue, I'm not sure I feel comfortable with that approach personally.
No, well, that's the extreme. Is what's going on with it. I think it's called ICE.
ICE,
where
yeah.
often people out of uniform are snatching unregistered migrants off the streets of the United States. They go to courts where these people are going to turn up and lift them from the courts. They sometimes detain them in the streets and evict them.
So if you're not going to do that, Jim, what would your answer be?
Well, just something a little shorter. I mean, we're getting into dismal territory here. I've been forced into a position which I am not comfortable with, but I'm certainly not comfortable with this. The trouble about one in, one out. A lot of people listening to this podcast will say, yeah, and 22,000 people have come across the channel this year already. I mean, one in, one out doesn't remotely solve that problem. And furthermore, it's not clear to me that this has been approved yet by the European Parliament or by Greece, Italy, and Malta and Spain, because there's an implication that the people we send back won't stay in France, but will be sent back to the original country of entry. And this, as far as I can see, could all collapse if they don't agree to this. So I don't think we're there at all. No, I mean, one's forced into the position of deterrence, that they've got to be deterred, and that could mean derogation from various clauses of the European Convention. Although hopefully we don't want to be isolated in doing that, and there may be talk about revision of that, because it was invented at a time, as we've discussed before, when we were talking about genuine refugees from places like Nazi Germany and things like that, not to relieve the world's, albeit very serious, poverty and violence issues. It wasn't designed for that, but much more severe detention arrangements in this country, that you won't go to hotels, you will actually go to, I don't know what else to call them, but sort of detention areas where it'll be a pretty Spartan regime, and that will be the fate of people who come here by illegal boats. And the theory behind that is that message will get back down the line and will stop the flow. I mean, the last thing I'd say is that, I mean, Trump's gone too far for me, but apparently the entries across the Mexican border now are down to a trickle.
Yeah. I think what I'd say, though, Jim, is that it's not the people who are coming across on the boats who are in the hotels. They disappear into the ether, don't they? They don't rock up anywhere and say, give us a hotel, because they're here illegally. So my understanding is that, in fact, it's not my understanding, my absolute sure fact on this is that the people in hotels are people who've been waiting for their asylum applications to be processed. So, or in the case of the tickle trout in Preston, which has caused such a controversy, Afghans who helped us during the Afghan war are in hotels. Now, you're not suggesting that people like that ought to be put in detention centres, are you, Jim?
No, I mean, with the Ukrainians, which we quite rightly adopted a liberal approach, an awful lot of them have either gone back or expressing the wish to go back to their country. And so when we've got an obligation to people like Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, no, I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just curious. So people that come over on the boats don't go into hotels; they just eventually just let free.
Well, they go and
go
work in the black
economy?
market, don't they? And maybe they pop up with
Well, that's what
documentation that's
yeah. Well, that's what
go on.
Macron was referring to, the pull factor. They know that they come across in the boat, and they, if this is true, they immediately go into the black economy and start working. And that's exactly what Macron's on about. This is the problem. We are a pull factor. We don't.
Yeah, but it happened.
By detaining them.
But the point, I mean, the point I've made, and I'm not dismissing the fact that immigration is a huge problem, needs to be tackled. We've also got to be careful we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here, because we're an ageing population with lots of vacancies that Brits won't do. And we've discussed that ad nauseum previously. So it's not a case of taking the Farage route on this and sending everyone back home. And indeed, even in America, the farmers are going bananas. Forgive the pun, because they can't get people to pick crops now, and all the immigrants are quite literally running for the hills. So that's causing an economic hit to the states as well. But in terms of the point that you're making on incentivizing people to come here, the point that Macron was making is that this is an issue for the whole of Europe. This is an issue for everywhere that is seen as a wealthy country. And part of this problem actually goes back to the fact that we are allowing lots more wars to start. We are cutting aid and therefore creating increased poverty in these places where we should be giving them a hand up and saying to them, start to create environments where you can live in your own land and make a good life for yourselves. We've stopped all of that, and then we're saying, and by the way, we don't want you coming here either. So for me, the whole approach and strategy is very short-sighted, very narrow-minded, and I'm not in any way, Jim, saying that you're wrong and that this isn't an issue that needs to be addressed, but I doubt very much that the sort of things that you're seeing happening in the States could be introduced in little old Blighty. Let's remember how big the United States is and how much resource Trump has got to put into solving that problem. I just don't think that's an option for the government here, which is why cooperation with our European partners, small step, okay, but one in the right direction with Macron, is hugely important. Before I bring you in, Joe, because you're aware of this, sat in Kent more so than most people, final point I'll make, just a reminder, of course, when we were in the European Union, we were able to send people back to the first country that they came from in Europe. So if they come across the whole of Europe to land in Britain, we were able to lawfully just return them. And guess what? We weren't able to do that with Brexit. Joe?
No, well, you took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, that was the point I was going to make. Another thing from Brexit. And when you bring it up and you raise it to people like Nigel Farage, they don't want to talk about it. We came out of the Dublin Agreement. We don't have the right of return. I think, yes, it is very small baby steps, but I think what is significant is that Macron's visit here was the first European leader in 16, 17 years, and it was the full state banquet. Amazing. And it beat Trump, haha. And there was Mick Jagger and Elton John, and it was the whole works. So all of that is good, and clearly Macron and Starmer have a good relationship. The fact that we are even having this conversation with France is really important. The fact that there is this agreement, okay, it's one in, one out, and there's probably going to be, like Toad of Toad Hall, beardy blokes from Sudan dressed up pretending to be the wife of somebody who's come over and all the rest of it. I think, this hasn't happened today. This has built up over a period of years, and most notably since Brexit. And the government inherited not only the black hole of the economy, it inherited hundreds of thousands of people waiting for their asylum claims to be processed. And they are the ones sitting in hotels, as you rightly say, who would probably like to work and would be able to contribute to the economy. The other thing that I think you can do is, and it's this black economy, the sort of the underground stuff. You can't employ somebody unless they've got ID, which goes into that awful tricky thing, which, I mean, you know, all of us, I think, have had doubts and misgivings about having ID cards and that sort of thing. But it may be, and it was one of the points that Macron made, that maybe that is what we need. You know, you can't do anything in a European country without an ID card. And, you know, if you're the employer, whether you're running a barber shop or a bistro or a taxi service, you're the person that can't afford to take that person on, because you will lose your business, you will lose your license if you employ somebody who hasn't got correct ID. And that in some ways is, and the other thing, although I think it's utterly brutal and terrible for the people who've been conned by the smugglers and given all their worldly goods to them, is actually seeing the French police get their feet wet and slashing the boats. Because it's only when you see that somebody is physically stopping you that you realise, oh, okay, all their promise. And, you know, it's really windy here in Kent today, so there probably won't be any crossings. But, you know, we've had periods of very fine weather. And, you know, Jim says taken to well, not unwelcoming, not your words, but, you know, a Spartan. Well, they are. They're shipped down the road from me to Manston, where, if you remember, the charming Mr. Jenrick had the children's cartoons painted over because he didn't want it to be welcoming. I mean, the other thing is that you know, you actively try and get women and children, and I think people would feel more kindly disposed to them instead of looking at these desperately overcrowded boats of young men, you know, and you've got people whipping up a storm saying these people don't deserve to be our street, you know, we don't know how safe we are. Well, you know, they might be plumbers, they could be doctors, they could be electricians, who knows, we don't know. But if you saw families, if you could try and, or something like that, where I think people, we've got to a very dangerous tipping point, because I think more and more people have bought into the very, very violent anti-immigration thing, and we've seen the riots in Spain over the last couple of nights. And I think anything that helps has got to be a good thing. But, you know, we need to remind people why we're here, and we need to be seen to, and the French, you know, we've given an awful lot of money to France. So actually they can get their knives out of their socks and they can slash the boats.
Yeah, I mean, disappointing the approach the police have at the border in France. We've all seen the pictures, and that is something that does need to be addressed if we're going to continue to make a financial contribution to France to help stop the boats. But this is a hellishly difficult, complex, complicated issue. And of course, the explosion in immigration did happen post-Brexit, as you rightly say, Joe, and it was Johnson's point system, which Robert Jenrick, of all people, described in an interview he did with the New Statesman this week, of all magazines, the New Statesman and Robert Jenrick, as the worst policy that's ever been introduced into British politics. So that's saying something. So yeah, it's a difficult situation. Though I think we need to go away, Jim, you and I, and find out how many of these people from boats actually get put up in hotels, because I do think that's a bit of an urban myth. I think most of them either go, as Joe said, into very sparse detention centres, or mostly disappear into the ether, neither of which we want to see. You know, we need to find a way which is far more humane and far more sensible in terms of an approach to dealing with mass immigration, which is, I repeat, a problem for all first world countries. We're all having to deal with these additional people trying to get into our places because, in large part, they're trying to escape famine, poverty and war. It's not a nice place to be, and it's terrible that three liberals like Jim, Joe and I are trying to think of ways of stopping them coming to this country. But likewise, you've got to recognise that the infrastructure in this country simply isn't in place at the moment, so something needs to be done. Let's end on a cheerier note and go back to a time when we perhaps were a little more thoughtful about people who were living in other countries. And of course, it was the 40th year anniversary of Live Aid yesterday. Fantastic conference, a fantastic concert. I've never been to a conference that good. A fantastic concert that took place at Wembley Stadium, and Philadelphia over at the States at the same time, of course, put on a brilliant show. You do start to realise how old you're getting when you say to your 17-year-old daughter and a fella, "Oh, it's the anniversary of Live Aid." And the fella says to you, "What's Live Aid?" Now, to be fair, my daughter knew what Live Aid was, so a fella might just be a bit thick. But it is 40 years ago. And the other thing that was really instructive for me was I watched a fabulous documentary on BBC iPlayer, Jim. Big shout out for the Beeb on this. Showing how Live Aid came about, but then reminding me of what happened 20 years ago, which was probably more important, and that was Live Aid, and the role that by this point a much less popular Tony Blair played in bringing the G8 together and actually getting them to write off. Can you imagine this now? Write off the debt of third world countries, billions of pounds just written off. And Blair persuaded people like Putin and George Bush to get behind this initiative. Absolutely incredible. But Joe, you worked with the great man himself, Bob Geldof. It must have been a hugely exciting and satisfying time to be involved in that particular campaign.
Yeah, Live Aid was amazing. And I mean, we did it from a standing start in 6 weeks. And a lot of what you saw in the documentary was exactly what happened. I mean, he was on the phone and he was shouting and he was, and I mean, I could tell you a million stories about trying to get John Travolta, who was willing to fly a plane, and Richard Branson was going to give him a plane to bring people over from the States, and Travolta was going to fly it into Murrayfield. There were amazing things. And just Bob had this brilliant idea of getting people on yachts who were sailing to bring people over from France. Now, were we having the same immigration debate 20 years ago? That would have been a non-starter, but we actually said, no, that won't work. But, it was much more political and it was much more important. And the thing that happened, I think, one was that Live Aid was about raising money and raising awareness. But then you had Live 8, as you rightly say, and the G7 in Gleneagles. And you'd got Brown and Blair, who, as I've said before, Bob used to call the Lennon and McCartney of politics. But you'd got Bob and you'd got Bono and you'd got other people like George Clooney, and you'd got people who had actually really made a point of understanding what it was they were asking for. They didn't just do it, perform. They really went on to work. They really went on to know their stuff. I mean, it's instructive, isn't it, that Andrew Mitchell, the former Tory International Development Secretary, is actually great friends with Bob Geldof. Tony Blair's Africa Commission, and all of that stuff that happened through pressure and that belief that you can change things. And I would like to think that, I don't think we would do it again, because I don't think you've got people of the charisma either in the entertainment world or in the political world. You've got idiots like Katy Perry who go, "Oh, I've been in space, look at my hair," for 30 seconds. But you just think that the power and the will of people to make change happen. Keir Starmer needs to understand that. He needs to get an understanding of, actually, if you want to change things, take people with you and you can really change things. But it goes back to, what have we done? We've now cut foreign aid. What have we done? We've ignored climate change, and more parts of the world are uninhabitable. They're impossible to cultivate and grow stuff. So we're going to see more famine, more floods, more droughts, more wars. And we've gone backwards from 20 years ago. But I must just ask you, Frank and Jim, did either of you ever have mullets? Because my God, there were a lot of mullets, weren't there?
I, as a younger man, absolutely did. I'm not sure whether James ever has. I think he's always been bald. But I did. I have to say, Jim, on a serious note, I was watching that documentary series with interest, and it struck me that the first time around, so 40 years ago, Live Aid, it was very much a cultural campaign of pop stars and entertainers coming together. And of course, it was having witnessed those terrible pictures again from BBC News of the famine in Ethiopia and those poor kids who were quite literally starving to death. And Geldof Midjor decided to basically make a record. That's where it all started. It was Do They Know It's Christmas? And then subsequently we got the concerts. At the time there was a hell of a row over whether the money raised should be taxed. So Geldof and Thatcher went head to head, and the Irishman won that particular discussion. But there wasn't that political weight put behind Live Aid, in the way in which 20 years later Live Aid came together. And I would say, Joe, I think somebody like a Taylor Swift
yes,
is socially conscious, could certainly get that sort of movement going. But the other point you make, which I think is a very important one, doubt very much whether she get the same sort of sympathy from the political leadership around the world these days. And are people in that same headspace, Jim? Because we seem to be a more selfish community now, don't we? Not just here, but across Europe and into the States.
Yes, I think we are in a darker place where everyone's looking after themselves, and we've got world leaders like Putin and Trump. That's not a surprise. But I was going to say that I would have thought Taylor Swift would have the capacity to overwhelm that sort of selfishness and really get it going. I mean, obviously Joe's made the major contribution on this, being actually involved in it. I only have one or two quick things to pick up of a more trivial nature. I mean, I've followed the debate over whether do they know it's Christmas? There's been a lot of controversy about that. That was really patronizing, because in Ethiopia, well, there are a Christian country, and so some parts of it are, but that sort of, Christmas is not significant for Muslims and Jews and people like that, and that we were being a sort of imperialist, patronizing. But Ethiopia, of course, was never part of. It was the Italians trying to make it part of their empire, and they were kicked out. But there's been that debate, and Michael Burke, who did the report and was accused of being patronising in his report, has just said, if people are scrabbling around in dung heaps trying to find some seeds to eat, they would actually value the report that Michael Burke actually did. Just on the pop side of it, of course, it really galvanized the stadium concert concept, which is now so much part and parcel of our lives. I mean, I was reading the other day that the actual tracks of pop music and so on, because of Spotify and so on, people can get that, but people flock to major concerts for the experience, and you can trace it back beyond that. Of course, there were pop festivals at Woodstock and so on, but it really galvanized that. And how nice it was watching the actual 7 hours. I didn't watch all 7 hours of it at the weekend, but to see bands like The Who, Black Sabbath, who were performing then, and they were performing last week as well, Ozzy Osbourne in Birmingham, amongst others. But these are relatively trivial points to the important substantive issues that you've made. I would like to think that someone like Taylor Swift could mount this again, but as we will all agree, these are, with the best will in the world, sticking plaster solutions to what we were talking about earlier on. And you were quite right. The only solution to all this is a more equal world where people don't feel the need to move across in many millions. But that is a lot of people are going to say that's just pie in the sky optimism.
There is just one point, and it did come out in the documentary, and I mean, I know this anyway, but George Bush did give, and as Bono said, has done more in terms of health intervention in the history of health intervention, and probably saved something like 26 million people's lives because of what he instituted in the fight against HIV/AIDS. Now, in a sense, people would assume you've got Tony Blair, you've got Gordon Brown, you've got Bill Clinton, all the people that we love to love, and here you'd got a guy who thought Bono was married to Cher, not Sonny Bono, who died some years ago, who actually went, oh yeah, okay, I get it, let's sort it out. And I think that's the other thing, that people want to be part of something. And then they can make a huge difference. And can I just say that one of my finest moments at Live Aid was having to ask George Clooney to get out of my office so that Bono could come in and do an interview, which often makes me think of you two on a Monday morning.
Yeah. Oh, Joe, honestly, we can only apologise for the demotion that you've had to suffer. From George Clooney and Bono to Jim Hancock and Frank McKenna. Bloody hell. That must be some challenge, that, Joe. Some challenge. Yeah, the point that you make there, Jim, which was picked up in the documentary series I referenced, and this was the politically correct attack, if I can put it that way, on Live 8 and to a lesser extent Live 8, I think. But Geldof's answer to that was the perfect repost. 26 million lives saved. Fuck off. And he's absolutely right, isn't he? Okay, we could all look at it today and say, well, there weren't enough black artists appearing in the concerts. They've forgotten, not really thought about how can we involve Africa in terms of putting a show on, and subsequently they managed to get something on with Nelson Mandela and in South Africa. But these are always the people, the glass half fucking full lot, the glass half empty lot, who will always find a reason to attack something, however great it does and whatever positive impact it has. So, I take the point that you may gain the words of the song, Do They Know It's Christmas? 40 years later, people can pick over that and say, but it's a bit like when people watch series of Friends now and get upset because there aren't enough black faces or gay people or trans or whatever it fucking might be. It was a different time. But ultimately, what those people did, what those group of white, very wealthy individuals decided to do, was make a huge effort to pull people together, to create a sense of community, and to raise literally millions of pounds, and then 20 years later get billions of pounds worth of debt written off from those third world countries, and ultimately save 26 million lives. So if they got one or two things wrong along the way in terms of not ticking all the diversity boxes, then I prefer to forgive them. On that note, I will say a goodbye and au revoir. I am away for a fortnight now, and so you will be left in the capable hands, certainly of Joe Phillips, perhaps Jim Hancock, although he's had a call from, I think it's Nigel Farage, to see if he's interested in getting involved in building some concentration camps in Cornwall. We wait and see. So Jim, Joe, enjoy the next couple of weeks. I certainly will. Been lovely to have your company today. And everyone else, have a great week. And please do come back and visit the Downtown Den Politics podcast next week. One final pointer for you. I had a fascinating conversation in the Den with Sir Graham Brady last week. That podcast has been published, and you can find it on Apple, Spotify, and all other good podcast platforms. Some really interesting thoughts from Graham Brady, and his comments about Liz Truss particularly worth listening to, I think. So, goodbye everyone. Have a great week. Thanks for listening.